Out in the woods, a group of friends decided to camp despite the tales of missing campers. Rick, the least concerned among them, brushed off the stories as mere fiction. As night descended, Rick ventured into the forest to gather firewood. However, he soon became aware of faint whispers emanating from the trees. Though the whispers sent a shiver down his spine, Rick shrugged them off and hurried back to the campfire. Gathered around the flickering flames, his friends began to voice their unease, mentioning that they too had heard strange whispers. The whispers seemed to be urging them to leave the forest, a warning that went unheeded. Rick chuckled dismissively. "I've heard the story," he remarked with a casual air, "it's just an urban legend. Nothing to worry about." But in a sudden, chilling moment, a scream pierced the tranquility of the night. The camp was plunged into darkness as a gust of wind whipped through the trees, extinguishing the fire momentarily. Rick, unable to see anything in the darkness, felt his heart race with fear. As the sounds subsided and the campfire flickered back to life, Rick saw the horrifying aftermath of the darkness. His friends lay torn apart, their bodies mangled beyond recognition, strewn across the ground around the campfire. Left alone in the desolate forest, Rick clung to the hope of survival, though it dwindled with each passing moment. The chilling realization dawned on him that the tales of horror were not mere stories but grim realities lurking within the woods. With a final, desperate cry, Rick fell to the ground, overcome by fear and despair, as the darkness of the forest closed in around him. The tale of Rick and his friends was just one among the many haunting narratives associated with these woods. It seemed as though the forest harbored a malevolent force, preying on unsuspecting souls who dared to venture into its depths. Not far from where Rick and his friends met their tragic end years ago, a camp for troubled teenagers had been established. "Sara!" Chris called out amidst the sounds of laughter and play. Sara, busy making s'mores with the teenagers, glanced over at Chris. Sara was one of the camp instructors, loving every moment spent with the teens in nature. The camp provided a refuge for teenagers from difficult home situations, offering them a chance to unwind, be themselves, and form bonds with others facing similar challenges. Sara connected with the campers, becoming as much a friend to them as an instructor. Approaching Chris, Sara asked, "What's going on?" He pulled her behind one of the cabins, pressing her against the wall as he kissed her. Despite only knowing each other for a few days, Sara and Chris had already formed a strong bond, drawn together by the magic of summer. Pushing Chris away playfully, Sara asked, "What are you doing?" with a grin. Chris smirked and suggested spending the night together in her cabin. Laughing, Sara whispered in his ear, "How about you meet me at the campfire after I finish telling the kids a story?" Chris nodded eagerly, his excitement palpable. "What story are you planning to tell them?" Chris inquired. Sara paused for a moment before replying, "I'm thinking about sharing some of the local forest's urban legends." Chris's expression shifted, revealing his apprehension at the prospect. "You can't scare them like that," he protested. Chris firmly believed in the truth behind the legends, finding them both chilling and inexplicable. "Relax," Sara reassured him, convinced that the stories were nothing more than myths. "I'll be waiting for you with a surprise," she added, subtly dropping her bracelet as she turned away. Bending over to pick it up, she let Chris get a glimpse of her red underwear, before she went on to join the kids again and resume making s'mores. As the evening wore on, Sara prepared to regale the teenagers with tales that would send shivers down their spines. As darkness enveloped the camp, Sara gathered everyone around the crackling bonfire, eager to share the tale. "Are you kids ready for an urban legend? This is the story of how the Whispering Forest came to be, the urban legend. You've all heard about Rick and his friends, right? They went on a trip to the forest and had the time of their lives until it all ended suddenly. They say they heard the whispers of lost souls. Well, the story goes back to the early 1600s, to a man named Thomas, just a farmer struggling to make ends meet. He was broke and on the verge of losing everything. So, he turned to the local inn for solace. Thomas started drinking, maybe a bit too much, until a beautiful woman approached him. She was Mary, rumored to be a descendant of local witches. Her mother was the head of the coven. After some drinks and conversation, Mary and Thomas went their separate ways, but they agreed to meet again. Thomas found a spark of hope in Mary's company. He vowed to turn his life around, to stop drinking and work hard to save his farm. After all, no woman would want a drunkard. Mary and Thomas fell in love, but her mother disapproved. She didn't want a simple farmer for her daughter, who was the coven's heir. Mary was torn. She decided to run away with Thomas, but her mother couldn't let that happen. She followed them to the farm with the rest of the coven and cursed them. The curse was simple: if they ever felt happiness, love, or desire, they would be damned for eternity after death. That curse still lingers in these woods today, Chris interjected. "Shh, let me finish," Sara playfully scolded him. As Mary and Thomas ventured into the forest, trying to defy the curse, strange things started happening. They heard whispers, saw bizarre creatures lurking in the shadows, and encountered spirits and ghosts at every turn. They couldn't bear the torment for long. They chose to end their lives by drowning in the nearby river. And that's the origin of the urban legend, Sara concluded. As the tale settled over the camp, a hush fell upon the group. The crackle of the fire seemed louder, the rustle of leaves more ominous. Sara glanced around the group, feeling a thrill as she prepared to unveil the final piece of her story. "And kids, they say Thomas and Mary still wander these woods," she revealed, her voice tinged with a hint of suspense. "Legend has it, they haunt these woods, tearing apart anyone who dares to feel even a flicker of happiness, love, or desire." Most of the kids chuckled at the tale, not taking it too seriously. "So, if we hear a whisper, we should be scared," one of the teens joked. "Absolutely," Sara replied with a mischievous grin. Meanwhile, Chris, feeling giddy and mischievous, decided to play a prank. Sneaking around the edge of the bonfire, he tossed sticks and rocks into the trees, creating eerie sounds. "Did you hear that?" someone exclaimed, while another whispered, "I heard whispers." Amidst the confusion, Chris burst out laughing, revealing himself. "It's just me, guys, no need to freak out," he reassured them, relieved chuckles echoing around the group. "Not cool, Chris," Sara scolded him gently. "All right, it's bedtime. Lights out in 15 minutes, she announced, prompting the kids to head to their cabins. As the children dispersed, Chris lingered, watching Sara. Suddenly, he heard something rustling in the forest behind him, but when he turned, he saw nothing. Then, faint whispers reached his ears, but once again, there was no one in sight. "Did you hear those whispers, Sara?" Chris asked, turning to her. Sara chuckled, shaking her head. "Come on, Chris, trying to scare me now? Did my story spook you?" she teased. Approaching Chris, Sara teasingly unbuttoned her shirt, revealing a glimpse of her bare skin. "Why don't you fetch us some wine?" she suggested, her voice laced with a hint of seduction. "Meet me back here in 5 minutes." Chris found it difficult to tear his gaze away from Sara as he hurried off to fetch the wine. As he closed the door to his cabin, he heard a noise from behind it, rustling leaves and snapping twigs. Curious, he investigated but found nothing amiss. Meanwhile, Sara checked that all the lights in the cabins were off, confirming that the kids were in bed. Satisfied, she slipped into some lingerie she had brought, preparing for the rendezvous with Chris. Gathering blankets and glasses, she made her way back to the bonfire. However, as she approached, whispers seemed to echo nearby. "Chris, knock it off," she called out sternly. "If you're trying to play games, it's not funny." Back at the bonfire, Chris approached Sara, his heart racing with anticipation. As he drew nearer, Sara spread out the blankets and removed her top, revealing her lingerie-clad figure in the flickering firelight. Chris's pace quickened, his eyes fixed on Sara's enchanting form. With a gentle touch, Sara guided Chris's hand down her stomach, the warmth of her touch sending shivers down his spine. Chris eagerly shed his clothes, his desire mounting as he closed the gap between them. Embracing Sara, they surrendered to the passion of the moment, the crackling fire and the rustling leaves providing a backdrop to their lovemaking. Lost in each other's arms, they were oblivious to the growing whispers and the approaching footsteps. As they drifted off to sleep, the whispers grew louder, and the footsteps drew closer, but in the haze of post-coital bliss, they remained unaware of the dark forces lurking in the shadows of the whispering forest. A few hours slipped by as Sara and Chris lay beside the extinguished bonfire, wrapped up in each other's warmth. Suddenly, Sara stirred, catching a whiff of smoke lingering in the air. She nudged Chris awake urgently. "Chris, wake up. The kids can't see us like this," she whispered urgently. Chris, still entranced by Sara's presence, reluctantly tore his gaze away as they scrambled to dress themselves. But then, from the darkness beyond, they heard faint whispers drifting towards them. "Did you hear that?" Sara asked. "Yeah, I heard it too," Chris confirmed. Hastily, they finished dressing and hurried back to Sara's cabin, their hearts racing with a mix of curiosity and dread. "What was that?" Chris questioned, but Sara could offer no answers. It was happening just like the urban legend she had recounted earlier. Chris and Sara had felt desire, perhaps even love, while the kids had found happiness in their newfound friendships. Sara muttered to herself, trying to make sense of it all. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream shattered the silence, its pitch rising sharply before abruptly cutting off, plunging the cabin into darkness. "Sara!" Chris called out, panic gripping his voice. "I'm here," she reassured him, their hands groping through the darkness until they found each other, clinging tightly for comfort. Then, as suddenly as it had vanished, the light flickered back on, revealing Sara's terror-stricken face as she peered out of the window. "What is it?" Chris demanded. "Look," Sara whispered, pointing towards the window. There, illuminated by the dim light, was the ghastly, contorted visage of a man, pale and wrinkled, with an eerie resemblance to the description of Thomas from Sara's tale. "Go wake up the kids, we're getting out of here," Sara ordered Chris. What was that?" "Was it Thomas? From your story? But it's just a legend, right?" Chris stammered, his mind reeling with disbelief. "You wake the boys, I get the girls," she said. As they hastily gathered their belongings, Sara and Chris rushed to wake the children, their urgency palpable. "Get up, we need to leave now," Sara urged. Confusion and fear swept through the cabins as the kids awoke to Sara's panicked cries. "What's wrong?" one of the girls murmured. "Just get up and follow me," Sara insisted. They hurried outside, only to be greeted by whispers and footsteps echoing through the darkness. Suddenly, a chilling laughter pierced the night, sending shivers down their spines. One of the girls let out a piercing scream as Sara whirled around, her heart pounding in her chest. There, standing before them, was a woman with the same pallid, wrinkled countenance as the man they had seen earlier. The woman's hollow scream reverberated through the air, tears streaming down her face as she advanced towards them. Sara's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the symbol etched into the woman's arm, a mark of the witches from her story. "Mary?" Sara whispered in disbelief, but her words only seemed to enrage the apparition further. With a gust of wind, she lunged forward, knocking Sara off balance and sending the others scattering in terror. The group watched in horror as the woman vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only the echoes of a distant scream. "Chris!" Sara cried out, as she rushed towards the source of the sound. But it was too late. Chris lay before them, torn apart in a gruesome display of violence. The boys recoiled in horror, their faces pale with shock and fear. "Run to me!" Sara shouted. Together, they fled into the night, leaving behind the nightmare that had unfolded before them. As they ran, the whispers persisted, haunting their every step. Sara glanced behind her and saw the figures of Thomas and Mary, the embodiments of the urban legend she had dismissed as mere fiction. Her mind raced, consumed by the singular goal of leading the children to safety. Finally, as they reached the end of the path, Sara urged the children forward with a final cry of "Run!" But before she could join them, a sudden impact sent her sprawling to the ground. With a cry of terror, she was dragged away into the darkness, her screams fading into the night as the children fled, never to see Sara again.